Thank you. Thank you to Korea for hosting this conference, and thank you for having invited the OECD to be here today. What I would like to do during the next 20 minutes is three things. First, in a first section, I would like to show again, I'm sorry this has been presented already by some previous speakers, but how Korea compares to other OECD countries and what are the long-term challenges Korea may have to face. And that is partly based on a publication, an annual publication by the OECD, which is called Going for Growth, that some of you may have heard about. Second, I would like to say a few words about the short-term challenges that the crisis has raised in many OECD countries, and how these challenges may be a bit different from what Korea must face. But still, part of these challenges and of the policy responses adopted by countries during the crisis and also before the crisis may be indicative of ways to address issues that are more specific to Korea. So that will be my third part. So let's start with the long-term challenges and the comparison with OECD country. As everybody knows, Korea has been catching up fast with the richest half of OECD, but GDP per capita, of course, is still about 30% below the richest OECD countries. And this is mostly due to low labor productivity. This is a feature of most so-called emerging economies, and not only of emerging economies. But what is intriguing in some sense in Korea is that it has the highest labor utilization among lower and median income countries, much higher than the average OECD rich economies. That is, the amount of labor per capita in Korea is huge. So why, the question is why, first question, because I was not, and I am not a specialist of Korea, was why should Korea care about employment? And I think the response here is well known. This is because this very high labor utilization observed in Korea is all about working very long hours. The longest working hours in medium and large OECD countries are observed here. And Korean workers work a lot when they work, but not so many Koreans are actually at work. So there is a conundrum here that Korea has to address and to certainly keep catching up. And that's where probably the most important reserve for catch-up is there. And correspondingly, with these very long working hours, the employment rate in Korea is below the OECD average. Not much, but still. And the government target of 70% employment, of course, is ambitious, but Korea has shown in the past that ambitious targets can be met. And also, as it has been said before, a number of countries have already reached such targets, Germany, UK, but also Canada and the Nordic countries have a very high employment rate. But how to do that? And that's the issue today. One other very good feature of Korea is that the unemployment rate is very low. I think it's still below 3.5%. That's certainly very enviable for most OECD countries. So that higher employment cannot be obtained by addressing unemployment. Not much more is to be gained out of reducing unemployment. What Korea needs to do, as it has well been identified, is to increase the participation rate in the labor market, which is low compared to other OECD countries and even to some other G20 countries. So there is room for improvement. Total participation rate is much below the best performers, and women participation rate is especially low in Korea, which suggests that efforts should be focused on getting more women into work, and such efforts would have high returns in terms of total employment and of GDP per capita. This is also this is extremely important because, as mentioned before, Korea is the fastest aging country in OECD, one of the lowest dependency ratio now in the OECD, or at a level comparable with many emerging economies. But by 2050, it will have the highest dependency ratio, perhaps after Japan. But this will certainly raise huge challenges, having such a rapid shift in demography and in the composition of the population. And here we must recognize that just increasing female participation to the current level of male participation in the labor market would go already a long way into meeting the challenges raised by aging. Labor force would still be hump-shaped as it is planned to be, but it wouldn't, just having women participation at about 65%, which is the level of men participation now, would allow the labor force to be about the same size in 2050 as it is now. So, of course, going from there to 70% for all would even increase that by another almost 10%. And that would certainly be a long way into meeting the aging challenges. So before going into policy options, I would like briefly to look into lessons learned before and during the recent crisis. And this is, of course, important because crises occur again everywhere. And even if Korea has weathered very well this one so far, not least in terms of unemployment, we know that in past crises, in the Asian crisis, for example, unemployment in Korea had almost doubled. So Korea is not immune to shocks, and no country can be immune to shocks. So let me briefly mention the three main lessons we took from the crisis. First, employment development after a shock, whatever the kind of shock, depends a lot on the policy setup. So policies matter. Second, it takes a lot of time to bring employment back to pre-crisis, and this time it's even going to take more time than expected. And third, hysteresis effects. That is the fact that lower employment may translate into permanent lower potential output. These hysteresis effects are large and very costly. So, as you know, labor markets were severely hit in most OECD countries. Some were initially hit more than expected. For example, the US unemployment jumped just at the time of the crisis, much more than we would have expected from past US labor market reaction to shocks. Others have risen slightly less than we would have expected. For example, the euro area unemployment rate initially less than we would have expected, and this is partly due to Germany behaving very, very well throughout the crisis. but then later on it shows that it cannot easily go down, and the duration of the European crisis certainly illustrates the difficulties there. So neither the US nor the euro area are back to pre-crisis level. Of course, this partly reflects macroeconomic conditions and macroeconomic policies, but also labor market policies and institutions, and I will come back to that. A specific source of concern has been youth unemployment during this crisis. It has increased almost everywhere, and even in Korea, I think. Sometimes in very dreadful proportions. It's now above 50% in Spain or in Greece. And this can, of course, leave very long-lasting scares because of human capital depreciation, because these generations, these cohorts that are now faced with high difficulty to find employment will then be crowded out by new cohorts coming in when the recovery is there. And we can fear that their attachment to the labor market and their participation rate will go down, so that potential output will be affected durably. And there is indeed evidence from past crises that affected cohorts of youth will remain characterized by low wages and low employment for very long after the crisis is over. The problem is compounded by the sharp increase in long-term unemployment. That is, people remaining in unemployment for a long period. And that shows that outflows, what we call outflows from unemployment, that is, people are entering unemployment and then we need to bring them out of that. These outflows have been strongly reduced during the crisis, and certainly bringing up these outflows again is a challenge for many countries. And there again, we have, during this unemployment spell for an individual, there is depreciation of human capital, there is a loss of attachment to the labor market, and there is risk to the potential output and long-term scares on human capital, both on quantity of human capital and on its quality. So young unemployment and long-term unemployment together form a toxic mix, and we see labor participation down in the younger cohorts, whereas it has increased in the older cohorts, but this doesn't matter as much, because that's what matters is the participation of the youth, because that's the future, and that's these cohorts that are going to stay in the working age population for the next 40 years. So let me turn to policies that may boost employment by trying to focus on those who may be more relevant for Korea. In most countries during the last 5 years, policies have had to deal with the short-term challenges of the crisis, of course, and of rising the outflows from unemployment, and also with the long-term challenges of demographic trends. And a number of good policies have been identified, and I will in the OECD, and I would like to share that with you. So let's start with women participation in the labor market, which had been identified as a challenge in here. We have observed across OECD countries that preschool and childcare public spending is associated with higher participation of women in the labor market. And this is good for participation, hence for GDP, but also good beyond GDP, of course, because that fosters a better work-life balance, both for women and for men, of course, and it provides women with more choices. They can work if they want, they can also have more children if they want. So that would also be good in an aging society in terms of demographic effect. And while Korea has already increased its childcare a lot, much remains to be done on the preschool public spending, that is very early childhood. This, of course, would also create jobs at the same time. Of course, this is partly a cultural issue. Other countries are addressing the same kind of problems, for example, Germany. And because this is a cultural issue, the market may not be able to deliver the services as we would expect from something which is needed. That's why probably public money and public incentives are necessary to set up an adequate level of early childhood preschool services. Second, and also related to women participation, developing part-time jobs. That has been said. This slide I have already shown. I show it again because to call your attention to another feature of the position of Korea, that's the fact that in most countries, in average, working women work much less than working men. Whereas in Korea, the difference is very small. It points that part-time jobs are underdeveloped and not available to women, basically. And again, making part-time more attractive and more available would increase participation and employment and GDP, and also be good for well-being, work-life balance, and it would create jobs. And related to development of part-time work is the question of the status of the part-timers. It has been also mentioned. I am sorry I have to repeat a number of things. But often, and I think it's the case in Korea, part-timers are not considered as regular workers. This creates what we call dualism. And dualism in this sense is a bad thing. That is the fact there are two categories of workers. One benefit, the regular workers benefiting from a strong employment protection, and others with much weaker protection. That means that when a shock comes in, it certainly reduces the impact of the shocks on regular workers, which may be seen as a good thing for them. But at the same time, the shock affects disproportionately the other categories that are the youth and the women. And that also comes with higher unemployment persistence after a shock and higher long-term unemployment, because there is this population of youth and women that cannot really access the regular workers' population. And an additional drawback of such situation is that, excuse me, it may also reduce employment of older workers at a time when sometimes productivity goes down a little bit, with very strong protection of the employment and of the wages of older workers. Firms may have no choice but firing them. And that's probably another problem at the other end of the age spectrum. Another equity issue that is related to dualism in the labor market is the question of the unemployment insurance. Dualism is not only a question of wages and of conditions of work. It's also about what kind of insurance is provided to different categories of workers. And it's also it's an equity issue, of course, to have different categories with different insurance, but it's also an efficiency issue because it prevents the unemployed, the uncovered unemployed to have the time to find a new job, and they may be tempted just to withdraw from the labor market, or they may be tempted to accept the first job that comes, which may not be the one for which they would be the most productive. So during the crisis, many countries have extended the duration of unemployment benefits, and they have extended the eligibility of and to increase the coverage of unemployment insurance. And the OECD recommendation is certainly to make this increase in coverage, in eligibility, permanent, provided they are coupled with adequate conditionality and activation measures. That is something that makes sure that people are actually induced into taking jobs. And so a priority for reform would be to reduce the dualism of the labor, of the labor market by both reducing the protection from which the regular workers benefits and increasing the protection and the insurance coverage of the non-regular worker. And at the end, that's the case in the Nordic countries, for example, there is no difference at all between regular and non-regular. So it's perfectly harmonized, and it may not be a complete chance that these Nordic countries, or still four of them, have also the highest participation rate and a very high employment ratio. This has to be coupled, of course, with active labor market policies, and that's something else the OECD has been recommending in a number of countries, and I think here as well, that is policies that help unemployed to find a job that suits them. Finally, I would like to call your attention to a point which I think will be a challenge if the 70% employment target is met, as I think it will be. That is the fact that when you bring new people into the labor market, into work, usually those people are a bit less productive than the previous ones. So it comes usually with some drop in productivity and with some development of low wages at the same time. And that's certainly what has been seen again in Germany with the Hartz reforms that have created a number of jobs, part-time jobs, etc., but also a number of very low-paid jobs. So there is an employment productivity nexus that should be addressed and which may be particularly acute here because even at current not so high participation rates, already there is a high prevalence of low-paid work, which may be seen as a problem. So that productivity-enhancing reforms are certainly necessary as a good companion to employment boosting reforms. So how to do that? Well, of course, you have to focus on low productivity firms or low productivity jobs so that to increase those. Here, we think that product market regulations are key and that more could be done to allow more competition that would boost innovation and productivity across different categories of products. Finally, bringing more people to the labor market will involve some fall in productivity. It may be partly offset by productivity enhancing measures as relaxing product markets or things like that. But it will likely result in any case in a further increase in the prevalence of low wages, so that boosting productivity may not be enough in itself, and any country should consider in such a case whether a more redistributive tax and benefit system may not be needed. Korea here is an outlier, certainly, in terms of what the tax and benefit systems achieves as how much it reduces pre-tax and pre-benefit inequality. Actually, Korea is a country that reduces the least inequalities through its tax and benefit system, which may be partly due to the fact that taxes are low here, which is a good thing and good for growth, of course. But still, there may be ways to improve a little bit the redistributive qualities of the system while keeping its good effects on growth. So, to conclude, a comprehensive strategy is certainly welcome and certainly needed. It should address both employment and productivity, and it may even have to consider new ways of ensuring social cohesion through the tax and benefit system. Thank you.